on the end scenario of that war. So some of it will be like scenarios, different paths that could have been taken, but the issue is here, and we should discuss it, and not discuss it only for Ukraine, but also, I think, broaden this perspective also for other countries in the region. Also something, maybe we are already over it. So what are the perspective for peers in the near future? So there seems to be no scenarios where negotiations make sense. On the one hand, I think we heard all the reasons for this in the first panel. On the other hand, we saw that the strategy of isolating Russia did not work out in the end. So we should face this and consider what this means. This is in particular of importance for me as a German and the German foreign policy perspective. So next week we will present, and this is a funny thing, an anecdote, the first national security strategy. So we did not have one before. And here's a whole question of how, when we are not in a situation that we can decouple from countries like China because of our interdependencies that we have. But we have now learned that interdependencies can be weaponized. This is the main lesson, I think, for Germany also that we've learned. How can we de-risk relations here? So this whole idea of de-risking in international relations is also, I think, a European question which is of importance. Also, the issue of democracy promotion, furthering democracy. So we all know that democracy on a global level is decreasing. So all the indexes go down. But how can we, as Europeans, also here find strategies against sabotage, against disinformation? This is one of the topics that our speakers will touch upon. If we think more in terms of what could be a stable and long-term peace, of course, I think the issue of justice. So the former minister in his keynote brought it up. So how can we bring justice here for the people in Ukraine, for the prosecution of war crimes, the prosecution of the crime of aggression? So what is the role of the ICC? What is the potential role of an ad hoc court here? So this is, I think, also an important issue. And then, of course, which came also up in the first panels, the whole question of reconstruction, the environmental damage in Ukraine. This is also, I think, a very important part, aspects that we should discuss. We also the local perspective from Ukraine, from the communities there is very important. Rule of law, the role of international norms, of course, is important, but in the end, also trust and credibility. I think the topic of what could be the lessons for the West learned from this situation. I think, in essence, and also it was touched upon in the first panel, so how can Western governments be more credible, be more trustworthy in the international relations, be models when it comes from climate change to conflicts, to democracy promotion, to Western intervention. So I think this is a very important topic. Brings me to the last one. We're discussing this all in a context of polycrisis. This is the war, we have the climate situation, we have the health situation, we have food security issues. So on the global scale, we have the issue of a polycrisis here, and there will be these points where other crises will also take this attention here. And this is, I think, also an important part of how to think of European security in the future, how to deal with the challenge of polycrisis here, because this, it seems, will not disappear soon. So this was just to set the scene for this panel. We have agreed to change the order a little bit from the program. So we will start with the impulse by Rivas. And now we look forward to hear your thoughts. So you have 7 to 10 minutes. I will be strict on this because to have all of you the chance asking questions after the impulses. And yeah, the floor is yours. Yeah, of course.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, hello. I'm really happy to see so many faces of people who are concerned with Europe's security architecture. And indeed, it's we're witnessing quite a significant challenge to it right now. That's why I want to quickly touch upon a couple points and then maybe leave some room for the discussion. I think if everyone's talking about it right now, but if we go back a couple years before, if we go back the day before February events, then I think there was a sense among many Europeans that we reached some kind of end of history moment in terms of security architecture in Europe, that nothing's going to happen, and that it's all right. Of course, that was not a case for Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, even before this military intervention, right? So I think this should work as a final wake-up call for NATO, for the West. There have been a couple wake-up calls before. Unfortunately, they've been less noticed, and I think this is the moment that we have to rethink the whole security architecture. But the question is whether do we need to change the whole security architecture or do we need to strengthen it? And in order to answer this question, I think we have to first realize that this war is not about Ukraine only. This war is about Georgia. This war is about Moldova. This war is about future of Europe. This war is about the freedom of countries to choose their own foreign policy, to choose the path they want to develop. And this is the important understanding we have to start. There have been quite a couple of surprises to Russia, as it was mentioned even during previous panel, and I'm pretty sure the Russians did not expect such a united response from European side, and EU support has been tremendous this time. But I would like to argue that only EU support is not enough. And if we look back again to actions in previous decade, nothing really happened after the 2008 war in Georgia. Then after 2014 annexation of Crimea, we witnessed a number of EU sanctions, but I'm sorry, but then we saw launching of Nord Stream construction, and we saw the new reset policy towards Russia, not official as it was after 2008, right? So again, this time it should be wake-up call even for EU, because use this soft approach that EU had before. I think it gives sense of impunity to Putin, and it gives him ability to go on with his actions, because on the one hand you say that it's bad, but on the other hand you continue trading and relying on Russia as a partner. So you've mentioned that we witnessed that Russia is weaponizing various resources, interdependencies, and that should be the serious point. But even with all the realization towards Russia, and I think this should be it when we finally call Russia what it is, there have been talks that okay, NATO, maybe Ukraine is still not ready for it, maybe we give other security guarantees, etc., etc. I would also like to argue that no other security guarantee will work for Europe's security architecture other than NATO enlargement, other than Ukraine's membership to NATO. Why? Because unfortunately, we have various examples of other security guarantees. Remember Budapest Memorandum, which is worth anything as of now? Of course not. We have tons of examples when Russia does not really care about any other agreement in international law, because it's Putin has this feeling that he can do whatever. But has Putin attacked any NATO countries? Not after they joined NATO. Putin has attacked Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Czechia, so on and so on, before they were NATO members. But he would never dare to go into confrontation with them once they joined NATO. These, of course, leads to my point that Ukraine should become member of NATO as soon as possible. There were two main arguments why some people in the West would contradict Ukraine's NATO membership, right? One was that Ukraine is not ready. Really, we used to believe that Russia was second biggest military power in the world, and look how it's going up right now. We were looking at Ukraine's counteroffensive, right? We were looking how Russians are doing, and I don't think that the argument is valid anymore. Ukraine will be a big asset for European security. Second argument, which we also heard in the first panel in terms of question, was Russia's response to it, right? And we heard this talk about Russia's nuclear response using of tactical nukes, etc., etc. I do believe that if West continues falling for Russia's blackmail and continues falling for Russia's bluff, then the whole European security it will not work ever, and NATO would just lose its purpose, because that's what's been going on, right? We've seen in 2008 that NATO gave a promise to Georgia and Ukraine that we will become members of NATO, but after that, it's been years, because NATO has somehow, in the West, somehow was falling under Russia's this policy of not to contradict their strategic goals. But if that continues, then we'll have many other conferences to talk about Russia's other aggressions, because I don't think they will stop. And in that terms, let's look at Sweden and Finland quickly. The two states which were traditionally not against, but they didn't really care that much about NATO in terms of their security, decided to join NATO as soon as Russian war started in Ukraine. How can someone ask Ukraine not to join NATO, not to do what Sweden and Finland are doing? Because, of course, Sweden and Finland are looking at less challenges from Russia, right? My point would also be that we should expand NATO membership not only to Ukraine after this war, but also to Georgia and Moldova as well, because again, both of our countries are under Russian threat, and if you look at Georgia's security posture right now, the main argument our current government has to justify its let's say, pro-Russian activities is that they do not have any security guarantees coming from the West. And that would solve the problem of going against the Western values of current Georgian government, and that would solve the problems which Georgians, we are encountering for centuries, and I mean Russian aggression. Just to quickly conclude, I would like to say that European security architecture works, but it only works for its members. And whatever we have to do is not to create another bicycle from the beginning. It's already there. We just have to expand it. We just have to get more countries in the club without any argument that politics is hard. We have to negotiate with Russia. We'll give you any other solutions. We have a lot of examples that it doesn't work. The 2008 Bucharest summit was clearly a mistake, and we would not be talking about Georgia 2008. We would not be talking about Ukraine, annexation of Crimea in 2014. We would not be talking about Russia's full-scale war in 2002 if that mistake has not been made back in 2008. Okay, mistakes have been made, but whatever we can do now is to just say what has been done and not to repeat the same mistakes again. I would like to finish my impulse statement here, and I'll be looking forward to hear opinions from my fellow panelists and from the audience as well.
Great, thank you for a clear statement. So learn your lessons from the past, but the system still works. It's necessary to expand. So this is, I think, one of the main points. But now I look forward to Migi's thoughts on the same issue.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. I'm actually honored to be part of this, I think, really timely discussion in really challenging circumstances, not only for European but international security environment. Before I go to before I address the topic of this working group, I would like to underline that the thoughts and ideas presented today are my own and do not necessarily represent any individual or the organization I'm working at. So I think the topic of this discussion, and before we start talking about the future, we need to sort of overview the current reality. What has the war in Ukraine has brought us, and where we are currently, right? So I'm talking about the lessons learned. First, we all know that the current military engagement in Europe has not been observed there since the Second World War. So it means that it's unprecedented. This horrible war of aggression has taught us many invaluable lessons, I think, and what is the most important is that it forced the international community to rethink the strategic approaches deeply steeped in European minds for many years, even after the end of the Cold War. First and foremost, I think it has clearly demonstrated the mustiness of the idea of buffer zones and the large and complex Euro-Atlantic area stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. There's never been time for concessions to the totalitarian powers, as Rezo has already mentioned. But I think Russia's aggression, hopefully, has irreversibly assigned these beliefs to the realities of the past. So these, I think, are the major lessons and major consequences of this war so far, at least hopefully. Yes, there can be some individuals who can debate these thoughts and conclusions I've just made, but still I think this is a really important step forward. So when it comes to the future and a future of Europe until the end of this war, undoubtedly with the full restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, there will be a new security architecture defined in Europe. We all know that a legally binding framework and cooperative security approach introduced in Europe after the end of the Cold War have lost their relevance. Europe needs the new security arrangements in line with the modern circumstances. And these arrangements, what is the most important here is should be presented in a form of a joint document and co-signed by NATO members. What this document should include, there are like many ideas and thoughts could be drawn here. What will be the content of this document? But from Georgia's perspective and from the perspective of this region we are living in, I think there are two main directions and two main important things. First is that this document should recognize the wider Black Sea region, which consists of Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And here is an important thing: if there's willingness from these two countries, meaning Armenia and Azerbaijan, as indispensable part of Euro-Atlantic security system. Such a decision will make this region a truly Euro-Atlantic sea. And I think this decision and adequately addressing the Black Sea region is a long overdue move, even for the current reality, and hopefully this will be at least codified in this new document I'm talking about. But there's one big but. For this to happen, we have an important homework to do. We can already see signs of very important and promising geopolitical shifts in this historic region of South Caucasus, and building on these encouraging developments, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan have to find ways to get rid of existing divisions and work towards establishment of a politically strong and intertwined region. The impact of this move will weaken Russia's footprints in South Caucasus and move this region, the wider Black Sea region, closer to European and Euro-Atlantic family. So this is one point. Another point is security guarantees, but before I'll talk about them, we need to properly address the question of NATO membership. So we, as Rezo already underlined, and I'm so glad and so satisfied that I think there is no hesitation, at least anymore, that the collective security umbrella is an unsurpassed protection against imperialistic ambitions of vicious countries. I can even say more that NATO member Georgia and Ukraine would have never become subject to Russia's aggression in 2008 and 2014, resulting in subsequent occupation of our territories and annexation of Crimea. And Russia would have never dared to directly attack the capital of the sovereign and independent country in the heart of Europe. And more than that, becoming part of European in Euro-Atlantic family is a historical determination of our nations, and in the case of Georgia and Ukraine, even codified in constitution. So there is no alternative for NATO membership of our countries, especially for strengthened European security. However, in the interim period before the accession, these countries should be assured with tangible and solutions-oriented security guarantees. These provisions should be presented in the form of commitments to the self-defense of these nations and provide them with essential military and non-military measures. These measures could include, but not limited to, diplomatic, economic, and military means, this has to be provided during the peacetime. But when it comes to the case of aggression, so in case of aggression, such guarantees will help these countries to stop the aggression and ensure capabilities to defend, defeat the enemy and defend against any threat. So I will conclude my short remarks here, and I hope it will trigger some questions and discussions afterwards. So thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Maggie, for also making a suggestion for some kind of a new institution, a joint document, and I think we will come back to it later and how it fits to the first idea of working within the existing institutions. I think this is a very interesting question, how to think both together, how it relates to each other. But before that, I would invite Rim to contribute with his thoughts, enlarging the issue a little bit in terms of economy. This is your background, but also information, disinformation. So I look very much forward to your intervention.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the future of Europe's architecture. The brutal aggression of Russian regime against a sovereign nation, and many of them over the past years, has threatened the way of life in Europe, has threatened the way of life in Western world. And so that means the architecture of that security needs to be revised, needs to be addressed, and we need to think what needs to be challenged, what needs to be changed. And I think this sort of last step of the military offense was a response to some of the weaknesses of some of the aspects that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to highlight, I picked 3 pillars on which I think the democracy, the Western way of life rests, without which we cannot have a secure future. And that's security of resources, and particularly energy, that has been weaponized extremely. And we allowed that to be weaponized. We allowed ourselves to be dependent on the Russian resources so much that we felt we could not even resist that anymore. I'll talk about the information security in a very broad term, because we also allowed ourselves to ignore so much disinformation, so much attacks on the truth and reporting of facts. We allowed for alternative realities to be created for us and provide access for that. And I'll talk about the political systems that we want to depend on democracy, we want to depend on people's choice, but those got threatened as well. And Russia has used those soft pillars of democracy, of security, of our way of life, already before this military invasion of Ukraine. So let me elaborate on each of them briefly. But to summarize sort of like this action, it almost looks like Russian regime is acting in this quasi-mafia or drug cartel, gangster type of behavior by creating terror and by creating conflict. That regime survives if it creates disarray, if it creates terror, if it creates conflict, and once that goes away, it does not have the foundation on which it can operate. Removing all these pillars allows the regime to continue to function. So it succeeded in sight of its state, but it tried very successfully, I should say, in the Western world to undermine those pillars. Right? So let's take energy security. Nord Stream was a huge mistake. It allowed to circumvent the countries that really were more alert to these threats and feed this opioid of energy to the Western world and get really hooked at the amounts that was unimaginable. Like in the previous session, we talked about China being sort of somewhat a winner in terms of energy, other resources at cheap prices from Russia. But even China does not allow itself to be so dependent on one supply source. Europe became 30, 40, 50% on some resources dependent on one source. And we certainly had withdrawal period. Now, I think we are much more sober in Europe than we were before. The threat, of course, is that we will fall back. And after everything is over, whatever the new reality in Russia will be, that we will fall back on dependence. We cannot. We must be very, very cognizant that we should never allow ourselves to be so much dependent on one source, whether it's energy, whether it's some critical minerals, or even other aspects. So thinking about energy, I would say we need to think even more broadly about energy as food, right? Ukraine is such an important part of food supply for the world. Would not be discarding the idea that Russia has tried to get another opioid in its portfolio so they could control the world that is hungry, that will be hungry, both for caloric values and also the energy that it already exploits so successfully. We have allowed access to our informational environment without any parity, right? So disinformation, creating narratives and realities without any check, under this sort of freedom to discuss ideas without any checks was not a good hygiene for our informational space in our heads, right? We need to lower barriers, transactional barriers, to realize what sources the knowledge is coming from, right? So as the technology evolves, as we become more digital creatures and digital citizens, it gets trickier. It gets trickier to find out, who is behind the information. Social networks have lowered the transaction costs for this information to reach our heads. European Union, Western world, kind of missed that opportunity to create media informational hygiene or literacy, media literacy in our citizens' lives. That, for security purposes, needs to change. We need to become much more cognizant what kind of information we are consuming and being critical consumers of that information. And then it comes at the end, this other pillar, political systems, the democratic elections and integrity of elections that are so critical for our democracies. On one hand, people are sort of worried about the polarization of the societies, but at least we are allowing for those opinions in the Western world to be there and to compete. That actually is more healthy than having one opinion where you cannot even challenge that, right? However, in order to allow those opinions to exist, we need to have the elections that hold up in terms of integrity. We have seen again and again that through interventions, very often through social media and soft powers of control of the media sources, the effect on elections, and not just in Europe, in the United States, have been significant. Brexit has been big influence of those sort of false narratives and alternative narratives, and exploiting the weaknesses that Western citizens have sort of developed because they were not feeling under threat. Ignoring some of the Eastern and Central Europeans' warnings that were much more alert. So what do we do in the future? Well, we should deal with the gangsters the way we've seen the gangster situations have been resolved in the past, right? So before I would even go to NATO and European Union, I would go first to the court system, right? So we need to have rule of law that's enforced. We need to have courts that react to the violation of sovereign nations' borders, that react to the destruction of properties, that react to violation of human rights and attacks on civilians and wars of crime. If we do not develop that system, then it's going to be easier, and not just with this particular state actor, right, as Russia, other actors will be there as well in the future. If we do not develop an international system that will react to their actions in a way where their powers are curbed, just like in mafia situations in the past in other countries, right? We will continue to have this behavior. So we need to deal with it in that kind of light. And NATO, EU are the systems, institutional setups that are equipped to develop the strengths and monitoring of these soft powers that we have in the region. And so they have a very major role to play.
Thank you, fantastic. So I think this was also very interesting because it put our whole topic in the broader framework of crisis of liberal order, right? That started years before this war came, and also showed some points where the regime Putin, Russia, took advantage of inconsistencies with liberal principles also in the Western world. So Brexit, the Trump presidency, which might have led to alternative facts, whatever this should be, and also the relativization, so this is English, I know, of the international rule of law, of international courts and norms. And now we are witnessing a brutal violation of international law, the most fundamental norm of the prohibition of the use of force. And so, yeah, I think we had 3 wonderful inputs. I have many questions. I put them down. We have now a little less than an hour for discussing what is on the table. And at the end, so I will save like the last 10 minutes. We have to agree, because we are all a working group now. We have to agree on some final results. But you are all invited to raise questions already now, or get ready for it. If I do not see questions, I would start with asking a question, but I will give you a minute. Yes, I have already 2, the gentleman in the second row. If you could use the microphone, because then we have it for the guests who follow us online.
And how to use this.
And it would also be great if you could identify yourself.
Well, of course, my name is Leonidas. I represent associated professor, represent Alta University here in Tbilisi. So I don't have so much question, but just to summarize what I was thinking while listening to you. Well, as I see, there will be not too much change to European security infrastructure or structure, which is mostly dedicated to the collective security system and will remain based on NATO, European Union, and Organization for Security, etc., etc. Well, I don't remember the full name of it. Mr. Kolesnikov from the introductory session posed very interesting question concerning, well, certainly United States, Canada committed to the European security. After the war in Ukraine, he raised a very interesting question that he sees, or he saw, or he understands that after the end of the war, Europe will become more consolidated towards common European values. It means without United States and Canada, which is the traditional Russian view that we are very happy to have our European neighbors more independent, or this is something else. How do you understand that? Previous question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Would you like to address the question to any particular person on the panel, or does anyone like to answer? So I mean, it is a question on which lessons will be learned from this situation on the one hand, and on the other, if we agree on this diagnosis that Europe looks more unified right now, so, but what will be the European vision of the future? So, will it be the transatlantic vision, so renewed? Will it be an independent version, like the Macron version when he just visited China? I think this is pretty much an open question, so I would also be interested in your thoughts. So, Rem, you want to start? Yeah?
Let me start very quickly, because this discussion about sort of two Western poles, European Union and United States, seeing them sort of like, are they competitors, are they collaborators? In this case, I think the collaboration is a key, because both regions, and when I say, you know, let's say America is with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, part of that realm, it's key that they all stand together on this. Because if you add the populations, it's still not even a quarter of the world's population that sort of aspires to these values that we really cherish, and that Georgia cherishes as well, right? Human rights, freedoms, liberty, self-determination of the nations to do things. We need those poles to work together on this. At the end of the day, I think it was a surprise to Russian regime that Europe stood so well together, because I think they've seen reactions during COVID where they tried to undermine all those sort of, and used all those channels to create disarray, create the distractions, divide the societies. They thought that they would be able successfully to do that. Fortunately, their European Union stood very quickly together. Something got triggered. But at the end of the day, the reaction was driven by bilateral support, right? It was not initially the security of European Union and NATO that was the driver of the security. It was those individual relations. And that's why I think it's so important that whatever that macro security architecture is, that it rests on very strong micro foundations. And on this, I mean interactions at the state level, and each state securing those soft pillars for their democracies and their systems, so that when anything gets triggered, they can rely on those bilateral relations as well.
Well, actually, I would like to say that the war in Ukraine was the biggest test for transatlantic unity, actually. And I think they passed this exam very well, and we can see the strong transatlantic unity. And I think this the tendency will continue even after the war in Ukraine, because there are a lot of lessons learned in this war of aggression. And remember that from the US perspective, they have even greater challenge coming from China, as they recognize their national security strategy, China as a pacing challenge and Russia as a acute challenge. So that's why building on this experience, they will become stronger and more intertwined in the future after the end of the war in Ukraine. I think this is the biggest lesson. So shortly and finally, I think there's no a future sort of kind of Macronian future and a version of Europe, definitely, because you can't see even NATO without strong United States. It's definitely, and the history has taught us this very well. Thank you.
Well, I would agree with this diagnosis, and what's interesting, I think, is that we have all these comparisons right now. So whether this is a new Cold War right now, this new constellation with China, and how it does compare to the old Cold War, and are there some lessons to be learned? So, and we have already collected some similarities, which would say, okay, there are points for comparison, but I think it's also interesting to mark the differences. So the major difference that there's China. But the other one also, and this relates to Rim's impulse, so the degree of globalization and interdependency, so this is different on the one hand, and Russia today is quite weaker than it was in the past. So I think we cannot get to a final answer here in that question, but to see how this constellation has also changed and what factor China would be, I think is very important also in this question. But did you also want to say that? Yes, sorry.
I'll have a quick remark. I'll be joining my colleagues about admiring the West for their unity, but I think on the other hand, there is short-term response from EU, from the West, and there is a long-run hopes for Russia. Whatever we see right now, be it disinformation campaigns, be it funding various alt-right, alt-left groups, Russia is counting on a couple things, I think, to tire up Europe for their support to Ukraine, to support some groups which are not really for thank you, not really for supporting such a long-lasting support to Ukraine, and the whole idea of divide and rule, whatever they've been doing before. So whatever I think is important is even in the long run for Europe, for the collective West, to continue this support, so we don't get another reset policy or another Nord Stream 2, 3, etc., etc. That's, I think, would be very crucial in the future.
Perfect. Then we have the next question, the lady.
Sorry, not to lose the time. Thank you so much. Thank you. My name is Nino Gelashvili. I'm a journalist from the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Georgian service. What Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine taught everybody was that some lessons and tasks of yesterday had not been fulfilled. So now we have to catch up. Georgia, first of all, I think. And yes, we are discussing here, I'm sorry if it's just my perception that I guess we are distancing too much ourselves from the current reality. What I mean is that when we are talking about security guarantees for a country like Georgia, and discussing that NATO should do something, should elaborate some kind of document and include us and all this region and wider region, etc. We have a Vilnius summit very soon. And I'm sorry if I'm not correct, but maybe I missed something. But I don't see and I don't hear any agenda from the state of Georgia, country of Georgia, and from its government, of course, who represents the country. And what I see also is, of course, Ukraine is the main issue on the agenda, and we will hear a lot, and we are expecting a lot on that on the Vilnius summit. But I don't know anything about Georgia's perspective in that term. And also, my question would be, what should Georgia do to stay safe and to stay on the, I will not go into details of Georgia's inside processes, we all know, and all these challenges and weird statements, etc. But what should be done that Georgia stays safe and Georgia stays on the right track at the same time, and uses time, uses opportunity, and also saving itself from the risks. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very important question, and before I pass it on to you guys, so I would like to add on that question with my question. So you said only membership works. So then the recommendation would be Georgia has to have an agenda to lobby for it. Sorry for the term. You brought up the idea there could also be some kind of different joint paper agreement, whatever, but then these co-signed by NATO members or NATO as such. This would be one of the questions. And what would you say about that risk that then these non-membership status would be that that could be the most decisive one, so that it would be less degree of protection here. So who would like to start?
Well, first of all, thank you for a question. When you started in the beginning, I already understood what the question would be, and it's correct one, because on the one hand, we're demanding kind of from NATO to consider Georgia. On the other hand, our government is in the best case silent, in the worst case blaming the war in Ukraine on NATO, which is shameful, especially within like 1 month period before the Vilnius summit. And I completely agree with you. What has to be done? There are a couple pillars, I think. From the governmental side, of course, the rhetoric has to be changed. I'm not sure if anyone in the audience can remember any positive statements from the Georgian governments towards NATO within last 5 years, maybe, because, okay, we've been talking about EU, we've been talking about EU candidacy, etc., etc. Even that narrative is a bit altered, like EU with dignity, etc. You know what I'm talking about. But NATO, it's been out of the agenda for some time, right? The government has been quiet about it, and the last time we've heard about it was from PM Garibashvili and Globsec summit, and I would wish he would just stay quiet again, because it made things worse. So what can be done? Of course, from one hand, you cannot ask for something from your partner if your government is not demanding it. And I think that's a part where the Georgian civil society should play a big role. Today, we're issuing a letter from academics, professors, universities who work on security-related issues, demanding from the Georgian government to act accordingly for this past month and spread the messages which would somehow flatter the play a positive role. Of course, I don't believe that they will, but there should be pressure from our side, somehow pressure the government. And from the other side, the idea which I presented in my impulse statement is that, okay, we see whatever Georgian government is doing, and they have this very non-rational argument about their security guarantees, which we currently do not have. And I think that from NATO's perspective, it will be quite a surprising and strong and positive move to somehow leave Georgian government without this argument that would benefit NATO, that would benefit Georgia, that would benefit European security. It would only not benefit the government who is against NATO, and it will leave Georgian dream in a very hard position, because whatever they're going to say after that. So that's why I put more pressure on the NATO side rather than Georgian government, because I know that Georgian government will not, unfortunately, will not act accordingly.
Well, I think this question initially was addressed to me, even though I was not mentioned. But so first, I have to distinguish this question divide this question into parts. First is the preparation for Vilnius summit. I don't think you need explanation from my side, but I still need to underline that the first is the political leadership, which makes decisions. Another part is bureaucracy, which is working on the preparation. So from our perspective, I can say that the preparations for Vilnius summit are ongoing. Anything else, I'm not in the capacity of talking publicly about that, unfortunately. This is it from my side. But when it comes to your question, why we talk about this kind of new document and also incorporation of wider Black Sea security or any kind of region as to be recognized as part of Euro-Atlantic area and so on, it has really kind of interesting background even before the war starts in Ukraine, and especially after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. We and also together with Ukraine, we have been advocating for increased Western presence in Black Sea and for adoption and elaboration first, and then adoption of coherent and really comprehensive Black Sea strategy from NATO side and from US side. So, and US, as you can see, there's no such move still. Just one thing, we know that US is preparing Black Sea strategy, which will be published in June. But from NATO's perspective, we have they recognized Black Sea as a strategically important region in their strategic concept, but there's no, let's say, as a document, a legally binding, a legal framework that will address this region adequately. This is really important. That's why I think, this is just my personal views and my thoughts and ideas, that there should be a joint document after the end of war in Ukraine that will address this region adequately. It should have been addressed already in this way. And also, when I'm talking about the document and sort of security guarantees, definitely we're not talking about this, and me personally, I'm not talking about this security guarantees as a sort of alternative to NATO membership. There's no such thing there. And even without the security guarantees, as you all probably know, there's a special status, sort of very famous one, major non-NATO ally. We have never, Georgia, for instance, has never applied to that status because it's wrong for Georgia. It's wrong for Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. What I'm talking right now is that my ideas are based on the proposal from the Ukrainian government about interim security guarantees, and you can actually read the document. It calls Ukraine's Security Impact or something. It's 9-page document prepared by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former NATO Secretary General. And the idea is that, from my point of view, is that these security guarantees should be provided not only to Ukraine, but also to Georgia and Moldova. That's the point. That's the thing. And they are only in interim period. And it doesn't mean that we should get rid of our Euro-Atlantic aspirations. That's important. Thank you.
Let me give sort of like a little bit, again, different perspective. If Kakhovka's explosion was not, or bombing, you know, and creating ecological disaster was not a wake-up call for Georgia, for Georgian government, for the Caucasus, that would be very problematic. We have seen already that Russian regime does not care about civilians and civil infrastructure. However, this is a completely other level. We have ecological disaster that could turn into radioactive wasteland for a huge portion of Ukraine if the water supply to Zaporozhia's nuclear power plant does not reach. It just shows how inconsiderate and completely oblivious this regime is about the loss of resources, land, human lives, for decades to come. Georgia has hydropower. I mean, it takes literally few missiles to create exactly the same disaster in the Caucasus. And as I mentioned before, the terror and conflict and disarray is what this regime needs to thrive. So we resolve it in NATO summit in Vilnius, Ukraine issue. They will need to create that disarray somewhere else to feed their own survival. So if the government of Georgia does not see this as a threat to its own survival, it's problematic. So, and I hope they do. I hope that this would be a wake-up call for everyone who still thought that maybe this is sort of some kind of isolated reality for Ukraine and not a much bigger issue.
Great, thank you. Just to clarify for myself, when I'm reporting in the final session, so the new joint document is in addition to the Kiev Security Compact, in addition to the question of NATO membership, and after the war has come to a final end. So this is the idea.
Yes, well, the thing is that I'm talking about, this legally binding agreements and documents that were signed after the end of the Cold War, but it proved unsuccessful and failure just because Russia was a co-signature of those documents, and Budapest Memorandum, just Reza mentioned, is going in this same box. So we need something like a Budapest Memorandum, but co-signed by NATO members. So that's what I'm talking about. It should not be as a replacement for NATO membership, definitely. It's something that guarantees your security and your safety before accession. So this is really important to underline. And also, it's what I'm talking about right now. It should be part of that document. That document should define new security architecture, which will leave no countries aside, especially those who historically belong to European Euro-Atlantic family of nations. That's the idea.
Yeah, great, thank you. I saw another question in the second row. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, hello. My name is Tamar Khunsaria. I represent the University of Georgia. I'm an associate professor here. Well, thank you, first of all, very much for a very insightful discussion and very interesting topics covered. And before I ask my question, I would like to share the sentiment of Nino, the question that was posed. I totally share the underlying pathos and the sentiment that was expressed with this question. And I think it was not really fully answered in terms of what we can do. I mean, what Georgia can do in the current circumstances. And I think that I would just partially share my thought that I think what we Georgians need right now in the current circumstances is a responsible political leadership, I suppose, first of all, and a very strong and strong engagement, both diplomatically and politically, to somehow anchor the country toward the Western institutions. So this is primarily an important topic, an important aspect of Georgia's policy right now. My question is actually a follow-up question of the previous question. One side of the coin is what should we Georgians do in the current circumstances, but on the other hand, what do you think the West, the role of the West, the role of the EU and the US should be in the given sort of scenario? As we see, that the crisis in Ukraine has basically showed that this was attack on a liberal international order, and it is a worldwide crisis. But it is also somehow a clash between the authoritarian and democratic systems throughout the world. So currently we are basically dealing with the paradox in Georgia. The Georgia that was once a front-runner country in the Eastern Partnership of the European Union now is pretty much, backsliding is a soft word, I would say, pretty much in a crisis and in declining of its democratic state. So what should be the answer from the West to the countries like Georgia that are pretty much, asking on the one hand to become the members of the NATO and EU, but at the same time are basically implementing the pro-Russian policies, and this is, I would say, deepening day by day in this country. So how should we deal with this paradox, and what should the West, how should West answer it? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So how should the West or members of the West react? Please, Rem, you would like to start? Sure.
I'll start. Since I lived in the United States for a couple of decades now, I see the sentiment on the ground. To some extent, the West is hesitant to be very proactive because they don't want to be prescriptive. They don't want to be telling people what to do, telling nations what to do. And so that's why I think this sort of hesitancy happens. And maybe Stefan can highlight more from European Union perspective. But in the United States, when you engage with people, with policymakers, with thinkers, in academics, that's sort of the reality that prevails. That's why in Ukraine, no one wanted really to jump ahead and start. When things changed is when Ukrainians stood up to the aggressor. David and Goliath's story resonated, and then it was much easier for politicians who sort of still reflect the sentiment on the ground, because people saw that the resistance, in the civil society and in the population was there. So Rezi mentioned one really key thing, civil society, right? In Georgia, you do have media that can discuss ideas, ask questions. You have universities that can organize forums like that. You have debate that happens. And, you know, without choosing sides, I would say this is where that action needs to happen. So if there is an initiative from academics or thinkers in Georgia, this is really good step to highlight what the alternative could be. It's much easier for the West than to engage in that and stand next to you when you see the active civil society.
May I directly add? Yeah, so it's a wonderful question, and maybe it's more of a German than of the European perspective I can bring in, but I don't know. So, I mean, I have these very general points. So, Germany, Europe has to be more credible and trustworthy in terms of acting within the international arena, international rule of law, etc. So, this is the abstract point, but I think it is pretty much important to be consistent here. As with regard to NATO, I take a more, so I think, so my personal view is, so Germany should be supportive of this. But what we see right now is the skepticism of German government, and the skepticism addresses some of the risks. So one of the questions from my side to you would be, what are the risks of, and I mean the political risks within NATO, because we have seen now what happened to Sweden, that it was not that smoothly, and now we can also see with further enlargement. So the decision making within NATO is an issue here, and there is the case. So should countries before they enter NATO have resolved their territorial issues? So this was like a practice of the past, with the exception of Germany, actually. So so this I think is a point which should be addressed at least. So and should be discussed. So and I think it should be directly discussed between German government, for example, and Georgia as such. So, with regard to EU membership, also with regard to Ukraine, it is being discussed right now. I mean, of course, this would be a very important step and a helpful step. But on the other hand, with regard to security, so there might be a European promise that might not materialize, because there's so much a disagreement in security military issues within the EU. So I think this is another risk which should be faced when discussing those issues. But when we take up these challenges and discuss it, I think so. My personal view would be this is the way to go. But I as an analyst, as an expert, I see those risks, and I do not see that it will just happen as we suggested or recommended here on that panel. Right. And then there was the larger question behind, so the autocracies. So I think for the German government, for the European governments, for Europe, I mean, this is the challenge we have to face. So how to deal with autocracies, because there will be no other way to deal or to manage the climate crisis, the food security, and all these threats that we all share. Yeah. It will not be possible to manage these crises only within a club of democracies. Also not just within the G7. So of course a climate club in the G7 is a step forward, but it is not enough. So we need strategies of how to deal with autocracies, but also of course formulating red lines when it gets to fundamental norms of international law, when it gets to fundamental human rights. So of course, but this is a challenge. And Germany has just started to this kind of thinking. and is now developing its security strategies, a China strategy. It will all be presented this summer. Yeah, it's the beginning of thinking of this, and I think it will be a challenge of the future to get these issues solved. But I think this is a huge question, and the risk is that this whole question of how to deal with autocracies, to manage these major crises that we all see, it could take away the attention of other issues. And this is a risk, I think. And therefore, it's very important to highlight these risks, to get the attention of Europe, of powerful governments to deal with those questions.
Just to reply on your question, I do agree with you that there is quite a big paradox, right, from Georgian side, and I think the collective West, be it EU and NATO, have quite a big of headache in terms of thinking the policy towards Georgia as of now. If we take EU, last year we saw that clear indication when Moldova and Ukraine got the status and Georgia did not, even though our government tried to sell it to us as a strategic win. Of course, everyone knows what that means. And this year, the paradox is, if EU decides not to give us candidacy status again, then I think the current government might might spin it into different direction with the whole disinformation narratives that EU does not want us. We have our own dignity. We will not. They punished us because we did not open the second front and all the other Russian propaganda narratives. But on the other hand, if they do give us candidacy status, that somehow would imply for Georgian Dream, I think that even though they've been autocratic, even though they've been pro-Russian, even though they haven't done anything from those 12 recommendations, they still got the status, and imagine dealing with them after that. But on the other hand, you have Georgian civil society, which clearly wants EU membership in future. So that's a big paradox. The same is with NATO, because the government speaks ill of NATO while the country desperately needs it. So again, I would not want to be in the room with those decision makers because it's quite a hard decision to make. But in general perspective, if we zoom out from this, I think that Europe has to, and collective West has to show a strong message to these countries and to Russia as well, because in the end of the day, if you do nothing, what message does it send to Russia? Does it send the message that EU doesn't really care, and NATO doesn't really care about Georgia? Because, as it was mentioned before, once Russia fails in Ukraine, what's next? And there is a worrisome answer to that, right? So again, paradox is there, and it's quite hard to deal with. That's why I put more hopes on the Western side than on Georgian side. And to answer your question about resolving territorial issues, you've answered it yourself, right? The German example, and you can easily have the fifth article of NATO to the controlled territory of Georgia with a statement that once the territorial integrity is resolved, then it will apply to the whole country. Because that's also one of the narratives, what Russia is trying to set in Georgia, that in order to get to NATO, we have to give up Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and unfortunately it works with some people. So I think clear statement even on that topic would do quite good.
Well, actually, thank you, Reza, for answering that question, because I also wanted to address the question. So I will not repeat you, but the answer will be, when you have precedent once, you can repeat it next time. So Germany is a perfect example of that. And when it comes to the question from the audience, what to do, what the West, especially US and EU, have to do in this rivalry between totalitarian and totalitarian powers and democracies, to put everything on the table to preserve and strengthen liberal international order. That will be a short answer.
Let me very quickly make a remark to what Stefan mentioned. I think this sort of fear that in poly-crisis world, dealing with this crisis in the most sort of seems to be a just way to do will undermine other things, is almost the thinking that Russia wants us to have. Because then they realize then that can be another weapon that they can use. So I think countries like Germany and other in Western Europe who sort of like saw climate policies being threatened if we engage in this conflict, be more supportive of Ukraine, allowed Russia almost to be more emboldened. We need to overcome this. In some ways, this already allowed us to think about more greener supply chains within the Western world that would give us more security, more independence from energy sources that would come more from local renewable sources. But to deal with the authoritarian regimes, in order to take away that weapon from them, that sort of blackmailing thing, we need to start tracking supply chains much better. So if you do things that harm the environment and you release continue to release the greenhouse gases, we need to be able to track that. And once it arrives at the doors of European Union, of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you adjust for that. You make them accountable at the border. So far, the Western markets are still the most wanted markets, the premium markets. And we just need to do a better job of tracking the supply chain. And that's how you can keep some of the authoritarian regimes much more accountable, because then it would cut the revenue sources. We are not there yet. We don't have a system to do that effectively, but that's what I'm talking about. We need to build these systems, and NATO, just as European Union and the United States, need to think about that as a part of national security. Like spending 2% on guns that end up being destroyed with one shot from a drone might not be as effective anymore as spending also a portion of those 2% on the democratic institutions, on the monitoring systems, on the informational literacy and informational hygiene that every citizen should have. That has to be part of the calculation now when we think about the future of European security architecture and Western world architecture.
Great, thank you. So well taken. This point of polycrisis can be weaponized. So this was really convincing. So considering the time, I think we have the final question now, and it is by the gentleman in the first row.
Yeah. First of all, thank you. I'm representing University of Georgia. I'm a student of Global and Security Studies. So first of all, pardon me for being a little bit prolonged, but I should ask first points in question directs to raise this point that the European security architecture works for Europeans, but not others, and for you, Mr. Kroll, as well. So how you think this new Franco-German duo, Scholz and Macron, could be more active, could be more supportive to countries like Georgia? Because we know that it's Franco-German nexus who is leading the European Union, especially after the Brexit. So could it be more supportive? Countries like as another one for the points of Maggie, as we mentioned, the importance of the buffer zones from Euro-Atlantic to Caspian Sea. The importance of buffer zones are very important. As also, as we know, the Brzezinski talks about it in his Grand Chessboard, that they circle around Russia, this buffer zone which is used by Russia, important to be filled by the blue rather than by the red. So how do you think, if the Ukraine wins, gonna be filled with the blue and from the Western forces? And the final point for you, as you mentioned, some mafia and influences in Russia. I don't know if you're well aware of, but I want to make this option because it's always hard to see from the foreign state that if you think that Georgia is a secular state, it's not. It's only on the paper. So the influence of the mafia, as you said, it's very popular in Russia, so-called theft-in laws, Vorzakone. It's very romanticized in Georgia, especially in regions, and it's intermingled with the Georgian church. So Georgia is partially only secular state. So what are your thoughts about it? So thank you.
I'll quickly start addressing the question about how Macron and Scholz could be more supportive of Georgia. I'm pretty sure you know the answer, right? It's quite easy if they stop whatever the Germany and France, whatever the positions they had back in 2008 during Bucharest summit, and think on the bigger picture. I know, of course, there are issues, of course. Georgia may not be fully aligned with all the criteria for NATO membership. Neither is Ukraine, neither is Moldova, and it will take a lot of time for those countries to be. But do we have this time? No, because we are creating these gray zones which Russia then will exploit at any cost. And the idea, we believe that Russia will change if we don't humiliate them, and we have to somehow do the diplomacy, as Macron would often say. Yes, I'm not saying that we have to become Russophobic or anything, but they have to show stronger will. They have to show the political will that they entail Georgia in the whole European security architecture. Because again, the mistakes were made with, be it Nord Stream, be it the decision they've made in 2008, and those were the two critical countries, while mostly others were on board. But as I've mentioned in my impulse statement, it's never too late to acknowledge mistakes and work and somehow get the lessons learned from them. And I'm really happy about Germany's U-turn in terms of policy towards Russia. I'm hoping that France will get on board as well sometimes, and that will only do good for Georgia, do good for the whole European security architecture.
Sorry, I have to ask you to clarify the question because I didn't really understand what was the question. I mean, what you were asking, especially about the buffer zones.
As I remember, you mentioned the importance of buffer zones, and I want to hear from you that you think that the buffer zone that Russia uses now, it's an encirclement, post-Soviet state, if it's going to be under the influence of the Western states, if the Ukraine wins. So how do you think? And it finally will be under the control of the Western liberal order countries, rather than their authoritarian ones.
Okay, I get it. But also, I didn't mention the importance of buffer zones. I mentioned that the war has taught us how insignificant they are and how it is important to get rid of this notion and the belief in buffer zones. And especially, I said quite on the contrary that this policy should be assigned to the realities of the past. That was my quotation, basically. And definitely the document I'm talking about, and Stefan was asking many questions to clarify the essence of the document, is exactly about the whole abolishment of this buffer zones, not only in practice, but even in the idea. I mean, that nobody ever should bring this idea again on the table, because this is really outdated. This is really a reality of the Cold War period, and it shouldn't be returned anytime in the context of European security architecture. So that's the answer.
The romanticization of mafia gang-like structures can be part of that disinformation campaign and the attempt to undermine some of the democratic institutions. So I would not discard that this is not a purposeful attempt to create that type of narrative. But this is not unique to Georgia or Russia or Eastern Central Europe. The lack of state action creates situations where gangs, cartels, mafia-like structures provide certain level of security for people, right? Hundreds of millions of people in Latin America live under such structures. What does that mean? That still comes at a cost. That individual security or family security or your small business security, it comes at the expense of higher economic development of the country, higher happiness index of the country, right? So as a civil society, as people, citizens realize that that's the cost, they should demand from the state to create the rule of law, to create the due diligence, to depoliticize the processes, and act on merit, right? Once we create that system and state creates that and enforces that, then the country, the society can move to that next level. So that's the key. And I think it's the opportunity for universities, for think tanks, for civil society to highlight that and bring that into the conversation.
Yeah, I have not much to add to your answer. So, I mean, there are options to speed up the process. So there are examples, and so it depends on the willingness of the members to do so or not. And France and Germany are members of NATO, but maybe more important, they have more weight in the European context. Maybe I can add a little bit here. Of course, I would agree that France and Germany should do more, but I don't. So the idea of a Europe where only Germany or France or both together are leading. So this is not the idea of Europe I have. So it's more like a supranational organization with more equality. So so I always have also some doubts with these kinds of images, but knowing the realities that, of course, in this situation, they have much more weight. And the main problem is that there's so much different perspective and views on current topics right now, and this should be the starting point. So that Germany and France should be more coordinated and more acting in a way to further their shared interests here. So I think this would be my answer. We have 5 minutes left, so this is just a very few time to conclude and to collect the points for the final presentation. So when I report later and say anything which you would not agree, so please intervene. I think in many ways we share the diagnosis here, so that the Russia's war is not a reaction of whatever kind of threat by NATO. So this is just Russian propaganda. So, and when agreeing on this point, so there are various things that we can take from this in terms of the lessons learned. So you mentioned Budapest, you mentioned Bucharest. So these point of learn your lessons now. This is, I think, something which is very important, and learning within the existing institutions. So to use NATO, to use membership as a tool here, and to be not afraid, to be not anxious, to let us not be being blackmailed by Russia. I think this is a very important point. In terms of how to get to a permanent and stable peace, more is needed. So reconstruction, democracy, justice, very important point from your impulse. I think we should also mention this in the final session as important points. And when we get to these final point that the war ended, also your idea of a joint agreement, a new institutions with regard to the region here as a new idea. This is also something we should put forward in the discussion at the end. So I think this would be the structure. So what can be done immediately in terms of lessons learned and acted? So we have an important summit ahead, but also what is to be done in the midterm. Justice, reconstruction, but also in the long term. So how can we renew? How can we also create new institutions to provide security for the people here in that region and in Europe? So this would be my final words. So I thank everyone. First of all, the organizers for bringing us together. So this is really a great privilege. Thanks to a great panel. So this was a lot of fun, and I look forward to continue over lunch, coffee, and later I heard also wine. And thanks for everyone here in the room for being active, for listening, for engaging, for asking questions. So this was great. And also for those who followed us online. So I hope it was an interesting session for you. We go now to lunch.
They were quite engaged.
This is also always a good sign.
I just wanted to mention that it's not a new institution I'm talking about. about.
Okay.
It's just a document, kind of sort of legally binding agreement.
Okay,
So
so
it's really important to mention.
institution in the political discipline, but not in the legal.
Yes, exactly.
So,
Yes.
because from my every kind of like from handshake to
okay.
binding international
It's
agreement
really
is institution.
okay.
But I can make this clear.
That's why, yeah, because I thought that because it's somebody else could also.
This is a disciplinary misunderstanding.
Okay.
So I will talk about it in legal
Great,
terms. So
great,
like,
no problem.
like a document, a communique, like
Okay.
this. But you mentioned legally binding.
Legally binding, yeah. It should be legally binding because what I'm referring to, I didn't want to go into much details just because